So this final panel addresses Egyptian religion in the age of the Achaemenids. And our first speaker is Alexander Schütze, who is trained as an Egyptologist and since 2015 has been with the Institute for Egyptology and Coptology at Ludwig Maximilian University in Munich. Today he will be speaking on Caro-Memphites and Aramaeo-Syenians, what the case of the Carians tells us about religious practices and burial customs of foreign groups in Persian Egypt. So please welcome Alexander Schütze.
Yeah, good afternoon. You see, I just skipped the subtitle. It was way too long. I also would like to thank the organizers for inviting me to join this very interesting conference and event. I'm feeling very honored, and I enjoyed it very much. I also feel very in a good company with the presentations we already heard by John, Charles, and who else? Henry, of course. And I hope that I will contribute to further aspects to the question of identity and authority. In the following paper, I would like to combine two topics that have particularly occupied me in the past month. First, my research on the daily life of the Judean community of Elephantine, and second, my explorations of how Herodotus' Logos on Egypt is related to the Cambyses Logos, and as you can see here, the results will come out quite soon, hopefully. Both topics have a common setting, namely Egypt in the 5th century BC, and of course, both Herodotus Histories and the Judeans of Elephantine have their place in Achaemenid studies. The focus of this paper will be on phenomena of acculturation among non-Egyptian groups within Persian Period Egypt, thus addressing the overall topic of the conference, identity and authority within the Achaemenid Empire. I would like to look at peculiarities of cultural appropriation as well as at similarities between these different groups. Finally, I will show how these phenomena played their role in Herodotus' Egyptian Logos, namely the book 2 of the Histories. The Carians will serve as an illustrative example, as they are well attested through numerous sources from Egypt. But I will begin with the Judeans of Elephantine and their immediate environment as the starting point of my research. The Judeans of Elephantine are the best attested group of foreigners in Egypt under Persian rule, thanks to over 600 Aramaic textual sources on papyri and ostraca, but also a lot of archaeological data that has become more and more accessible in the last years through relevant publications. In terms of the richness of sources, only the Egyptian community of Ein Manavir, south of Khaga in the Western Desert, with some 600 demotic ostraca is comparable to Elephantine. Since the discovery of the papyri by Rubenson and Zucker and their rapid publication at the beginning of the 20th century, research has focused primarily on the identity and religion of the Judean community of Elephantine, although there's not a single religious text in the strict sense among these papyri. Many other aspects, such as the everyday life, as well as the function and organization of the community, remain to be explored. And there are, for instance, surprisingly few indicators that the Judeans were actually military colonists. And this is the topic of research James Moore at the Humboldt University Berlin is currently studying. With regard to the everyday life, the circa 300 Aramaic ostraka discovered by a French mission under Charles Clermont-Ganneau are of particular interest. They are still to be explored in detail since they were not published in their entirety until 100 years later. The material culture to be found in the ostraka and in the archaeological record are currently subject of a project I'm conducting in cooperation with Damien Agu and Valérie Schramm, both CNRS Nanterre. The Aramaic Elephantine papyri themselves are by no means limited to this Judean community, but include ration lists for persons with different ethnic backgrounds, a letter from the Persian officials to the satrap Ashama, we already heard of today, or the instruction of the same satrap regarding the repair of a boat. Aramaic legal documents show that the so-called Aramean quarter at Elephantine was inhabited by people from different ethnic backgrounds, such as Caspians, Egyptians, or even Persians. In addition, the so-called Hermopolis letters found in the mid-20th century in a pot in the animal necropolis of Tuna el-Gebel in Middle Egypt. By the way, Tuna el-Gebel is the place where the famous tomb of Petosiris is to be found, as well as designations such as Aramean of Syene in the Elephantine papyri show that there must also have been a garrison of foreign soldiers in Syene on the east bank opposite to Elephantine, who in turn were in close exchange with other groups in Memphis. Syene was also the seat of the Persian governor, Phrataraka. Some legal documents from Elephantine have originally been written in Syene. Rescue excavations by the Schweizer Institut für ägyptische Bauforschung und Altertumskunde in the urban area of modern Aswan have revealed, among other things, remains of the Persian period. Under Persian rule, the ancient city was surrounded by a massive fortification wall, as you can see here on the slide. Residential buildings show astonishing similarities to the dwellings of the so-called Aramean quarter documented on Elephantine Island. Finds as weapons such as arrowheads and Aramaic ostraka mentioning Babylonian and Northwest Semitic names bear witness to the function of the fortress as a garrison and to the origin of its inhabitants. Salutations in the Hermopolis letters already mentioned, usually dated to the late 6th or early 5th century BC, mention the Syrian goddesses Bet-El and Lady of Heaven and the Babylonian gods Nabu and Barnet. That these deities are mentioned in the context of salutations may not be surprising. Certainly there were sanctuaries for the non-Egyptian garrison at Syene. Surprisingly, however, many of the letters mention the Egyptian god Ptah, patron of Memphis, in an elaborate greeting, although the milieu of the letters seems to be non-Egyptian. And some members of the family had Egyptian names, so a certain degree of acculturation is already evident in these names. Such phenomena are not restricted to the Hermopolis letters. Even in an Aramaic ostrakon from Elephantine, the local Egyptian deity Chnum is mentioned together with the Judean god Yahu. And in a legal document, the Judean Miftachia swears by the local Egyptian goddess Satet to a certain Peu. How can these references of non-Egyptians to Egyptian gods be explained? What relationship did the foreigners have to Egyptian gods such as Chnum, Satet, or Ptah? It is well known that there must have been a community of Aramaic speakers in Memphis too, who had themselves buried in the Memphite necropolises of Abusir and Saqqara. This is evidenced, among other things, by a number of coffins and funerary monuments with Aramaic inscriptions that have been found there. A larger part comes from the excavations of Gustave Jequier in Saqqara and is today, hopefully, still exhibited in the Egyptian Museum in Cairo. I have to check this. Particularly noteworthy is the votive inscription of a priest of Nabu of Syene, who had apparently been buried in Memphis. Sarcophagi with Aramaic inscription were also found in the 1960s near the Isis temple of Syene. In contrast to their counterparts from the Memphite necropolis, these sarcophagi also show an Egyptianizing decoration referring to Egyptian motifs related to funerary practices, such as the mummy on the lion bed, as you can see here. Special attention had been paid to a few funerary stelae with Aramaic inscriptions, which obviously show that the foreigners adopted Egyptian burial customs and worshipped the Egyptian god of death, Osiris. And I want to also mention in this context the recent lengthy discussion of Melanie Wasmuth et al. Of the so-called stela of Ahutab. These stelae are characterized by their original composition of scenes that do not find their counterpart in contemporary Egyptian funerary stelae. Some funerary stelae reportedly originate from the Memphite necropolises. One of these stelas is dated to the reign of Xerxes I, the early reign to be clear, thus providing a point of reference for the dating of the whole corpus of stelae. An offering table with Aramaic inscription, an Aramaic inscription found by Auguste Mariette in the Serapeum of Saqqara in turn even attests to the worship of Apis, the incarnation of the god Ptah, or more precisely of Osiris Apis as the netherworldly form of this god. These few and disparate finds have so far been considered in isolation without taking into account their Egyptian context in the 5th century BC or evidence from other non-Egyptian groups. And exactly at this point, I would like to take a look at another group that illustrates the life of foreign groups in Persian period Egypt, the Carians. Herodotus rarely refers to the Carians. In the Egyptian logos, they are mostly mentioned together with the Ionians. Herodotus tells how they come to Egypt for the first time under Psammetichus I, the founder of the Syene dynasty. The oracle of Buto had prophesied to the founder of the 26th dynasty that he would take revenge and unite Egypt when bronze men would come from the sea. And indeed, a short time later, Ionians and Carians in their bronze armor landed on the Egyptian coast. From Assyrian sources, we know that the Lydian king Gyges sent troops to Egypt to assist Psammetichus I. According to Herodotus, the Saite king eventually gave land to the Ionians and Carians downstream from Bubastis in the so-called Stratopeda. Pharaoh Apries had an army of over 30,000 Ionians and Carians, at least according to Herodotus, and Amasis had finally moved them to Memphis to protect himself from the Egyptians. Herodotus thus sets the chronological framework for Carian presence in Egypt, and this framework plays a major role for the classification of the Carian monuments in Egypt. In fact, compared to other foreign groups in late period Egypt, such as Greeks, Phoenicians, or Arabs, Carians are comparatively well attested by a number of different sources. So, their inscriptions on small objects, for instance, on votive offerings to Egyptian deities, Of course, graffiti, for instance, the graffiti of the Carian mercenaries in Abu Simbel, who accompanied the Nubian campaign of Psammetichus II, but also graffiti in the tomb of Montemhat in Thebes and elsewhere. And there are funerary stelae, more than 70 stelae are actually known. Many of them were found during British excavations in the animal necropolis in North Saqqara, in secondary context dating to the 13th dynasty, that is the second half of the 4th century BC. According to Günther Wittmann, these stelae can be in turn divided into 4 categories. There are undecorated stelae with Carian inscriptions only, Egyptian stelae with added Carian inscriptions, Egyptianizing stelae with Carian inscriptions only, as well as false door stelae with Carian inscriptions, as you can see here. Frank Kammerzell has put these different types in a chronological order. The simple stela with archaic inscriptions belong to the initial phase of a Carian presence in Egypt, roughly corresponding to the reign of Psammetichus I. Later, the Carians would have adopted Egyptian monuments and provided them with Carian inscriptions. And indeed, one of these monuments, an Egyptian donation stele, can date it to the reign of Pharaoh Abrius. And in a late phase, a distinct Carian Egyptian style was developed, represented by Egyptianizing stele with purely Carian inscriptions. And this phase would correspond with the reign of Amasis, although there are no precise indicators to date these monuments. From an Egyptological point of view, the Egyptianizing stele are of particular interest. And I'm happy to show you here this nice reconstruction of the supposed original painting of one of these stelae, now in the British Museum in London, provided quite recently by Alexandra Willing in the conference volume accompanying an exhibition here in the Getty Museum. They are recognizable as non-Egyptian not only by their peculiar style. The selection of scenes deviates from the decoration of contemporary Egyptian stele. While offerings before the god Osiris find their counterpart in Egyptian funerary stele, the protasis scene showing the deceased on a bed seems to derive from a Carian tradition, to just give example. The representations of the Apis bull, which are prominently represented in this material, are of special interest since they illustrate the special devotion of the Carians to this deity. Klaus Jurmann even hypothesized in a 2010 article that these were not funerary stele in a strict sense, but stele erected along the processional route to the Serapeum of Memphis, as illustrated here on the right on the slide. The Serapeum had been massively extended during the Sayyid period. Psammetichus I built the Grand Galerie, which still impress with their size. Stone sarcophagi were placed under Amasis onwards for the burial of the Apis bulls. Several Apis burials are attested even under Persian kings, including one in the year 6 of Cambyses. More than 100 stele also provide the continuity of the Apis cult under Persian rule, while in the rest of the country a decline in artistic production can be observed. Fortunately, photographs of these Serapeum stele are now, or at least part of them, available for study on the website of the Louvre. Biographical inscriptions on some of these stelae show that Egyptian officials and priests played an important role in communicating Egyptian religion to foreigners. A rare example is General Ahmose, who claims in a stele, "I put the fear of thee in the hearts of every man and of the stranger of all the foreigners that were in Egypt. I have acted in thy embalming hall. I caused messengers to go to Upper Egypt and to Lower Egypt also to cause all the mayors of the cities and countries to come to your embalming hall with their gifts." We know of quite a number of Egyptian officials, such as the overseer of the Gates of the South, Neshor, who supervised non-Egyptian groups in the 26th dynasty. After the Persian conquest of Egypt, Egyptian officials still played an important role in mediating between foreigners and native cults. And the most famous example is, of course, the Egyptian official Ujaruresnet, who was the driving force behind the legitimization of the Persian king Cambyses as Egyptian pharaoh, and organized that foreigners were expelled from the temples, namely the Temple of Night at Sais, and had to be settled elsewhere. But what happened to the Carians after the Persian conquest? We know through cuneiform sources that a part of them later ended up in Borsippa in Mesopotamia. But Carians are still mentioned in Aramaic documents from Saqqara dating to the 5th century BC, especially in the context of navigation. In the so-called boat repair papyrus from Elephantine, a letter from the satrap Ashama, the boatman Mithradata had reported a boat for repair, which was leased by the boatmen of the Carians, Psamshinite and his colleagues. The name of the Carian boatman, Psamshinite, mentioned in the boat repair papyrus shows that Egyptian names do not necessarily indicate Egyptians, especially not in the case of those foreigners who had been native to Egypt for generations. Carians were even buried at Elephantine, as shown by a sarcophagus of Carian's type, or a tomb of Carian type, still documented by the French excavation at the beginning of the 20th, century, AD. And you can see here, a photo of this tomb. We can also assume a continuity with regard to the involvement of the Carians in Egyptian cults and funerary practices. And here Herodotus comes into play again, because in the context of his description of Egyptian religious customs, Herodotus mentions the Carians in passing, saying, but how they celebrate the festival for Isis in the city of Busiris, I have already told before. All men and women inflict blows on each other after the sacrifice, many tens of thousands of people. And then he says that he actually refers to Osiris. All the Carians who are resident in Egypt goes so much further than the Egyptians that they also inflict cuts on their foreheads with knives, and from this it is evident that they are strangers and not Egyptians. Remarkable here is that he does not write about Carians of the 26th dynasty, but about those of his time, that is the middle of the 5th century BC. Moreover, the episode is embedded in Herodotus' detailed description of contemporary religious festivities in Lower Egyptian cities such as Sais, Heliopolis, or Bubastis. The practice of cutting oneself in the forehead with knives as a sign of mourning we find already on the Egyptian Nicene Carian stelae, which are supposed to date to the time of Amasis. The origins of these practices have recently been intensively discussed, while J. McAnally points out that this is practically not attested in Caria, Livio Iancu goes so far as to assume an influence of Levantine customs on the Carians in that case. However, there are no corresponding representations in Aramaic stele or texts from Egypt that would suggest this or support this. In addition, the conventional model of dating Aramaic and Carian stele would not support this direction of influence. Whenever the stele date, Herodotus attests to the continuity of Carian involvement in Egyptian cults in the Persian period. While Herodotus refers to mourning rites in the context of the cult for Osiris, a continuity is also plausible with respect to the Apis cult. Let me conclude. The Carians are representative of other non-Egyptian groups in Egypt during the Saito-Persian period. Due to their numerous monuments, they provide a model how non-Egyptians were integrated in Egyptian cults and practices in both Saite and Persian periods. Many were based in the Memphite area and had themselves buried in the necropolises of Abusir and Saqqara. After several generations, they even participated in Egyptian cults and adopted Egyptian burial customs. The Hermopolis letters, funerary stele, and coffins suggest that Aramaic-speaking, or at least Aramaic-writing groups from the Levant underwent a similar development. Some of these groups were probably in Egypt generations before the Persian conquest. The striking similarities between their monuments and those of the Carians point to their roughly common chronological framework. These groups were not separated by the Saite and Persian period, but show a continuity if we also consider sources such as Herodotus. It is also certainly no coincidence that they were especially attached to Osiris, the god of the dead, and Apis, the incarnation of the god Ptah. Both the Osiris cult and the animal cult, especially the Apis cult at Memphis, were very prominent in Egyptian religion in both the Saite and Persian periods. Egyptians, as well as non-Egyptians, took part in pompous ceremonies in honor of the holy Apis. Herodotus himself gives a vivid description of these ceremonies in his Cambyses Logos. In the case of the Serapeum of Saqqara, we can very precisely grasp the Egyptian ambience due to the archaeological of the site as well as hundreds of Serapeum stele. At the same time, Osiris festivities were celebrated all over Egypt. Herodotus also captures these festivities, mentioning in this context the Carians and their special customs. Egyptian cults and festivals played a pivotal role in socially integrating these non-Egyptian groups into Egyptian society. Herodotus reminds us of the performative aspect of culture, which is only indirectly reflected by the known indigenous sources such as the stele discussed above. Herodotus, in turn, had his own literary interest in describing Egyptian and Carian customs. On the one hand, he presented Egypt as a land where everything was done differently compared to other lands. On the other hand, he traced Greek institutions back to the land on the Nile. This also applies for his description of religious festivals in Lower Egypt, which provide the overall context of his description of Carian customs. This description certainly points to one of the underlying themes of Herodotus' histories, that is cultural relativism. And I owe these insights to the contributions of Liz Irwin and Anthony Ellis on the subjects, which were published in the volume you have seen at the beginning. Especially in the Cambyses Logos, we find cultural relativistic tones when he scandalized the burning of the mummy of Amasis or the murder of a sacred animal by Cambyses. Greeks themselves practiced cremation and rejected the veneration of animals as gods. Thus, Cambyses' alleged deeds were probably not so shocking for Herodotus' audience. Herodotus' cultural relativism finds its climax in the experiment of the great King Darius, when he challenged groups of Greeks and Indians to adopt the funerary customs of the other. His detailed descriptions of Egyptian and Carian customs can be read in this context. They were intended to show that customs were different in any culture, but inevitably determined the actions of people. The great diversity of Egyptian religious practices, but also the violence of practices of both Egyptian and Carians, as shown in the passage before, provide nice examples in order to highlight exactly this point. And that may be the reason why the practices of the Carians dwelling in Egypt found their way in Herodotus' histories. Thank you for your attention.